Everyone was sure that the single father had wasted his last money buying a broken factory for just $4,800. But when his little daughter accidentally opened a hidden passage inside, they stumbled upon a discovery worth millions, and it changed their lives forever. Subscribe to the channel and comment below which country you're watching from. Daniel Harper had always believed that life had a strange way of testing the limits of a man's endurance. For years, he had lived in a rhythm that was less survival and more a prolonged state of exhaustion. Each morning before dawn, he rose, his back aching from the labor of the day before, his hands scarred and rough from decades of menial work. He had once dreamed of a different life, one where his mind rather than his body carried him forward. But those dreams had been buried long ago under overdue bills, second-hand boots, and the crushing responsibilities of fatherhood. Since the day his daughter Lily had come into the world and her mother had left it in the same breath, Daniel had known that there was no choice but to keep moving forward, no matter how heavy the burden felt. Their apartment was barely that, a single rented room in a crumbling house that leaned to one side like an old drunkard. Paint peeled in strips from the damp walls, and in the winter the draft was so severe that Daniel often woke to find frost clinging to the inside of the cracked windows. The radiators hissed when they bothered to work at all, and when they failed, he layered Lily in blankets and boiled pots of water on the stove for warmth. Summer brought no mercy either. Heat swelled inside the tiny space, suffocating and thick, while cockroaches crawled freely across the counters. Lily never complained, though she had learned early to shove towels under the door to keep rats from wandering in during the night. Despite the bleakness, she remained bright-eyed, an island of hope in the middle of his storm. At 7 years old, Lily had an imagination that transformed broken objects into treasures. A crumpled piece of paper became a canvas for her drawings. Discarded buttons were her jewels, and the dull glow of street lamps through the broken blinds became moons and stars when she closed her eyes. She told him once that she liked to pretend their tiny room was a castle tower, that she was a princess and he her knight. Daniel smiled at the thought, though he could never escape the gnawing shame that this castle smelled of mold and despair. It was desperation, not courage, that finally led him to the auction hall that cold November morning. He had heard about the city's plan to rid itself of abandoned properties, warehouses, theaters, schools, factories left to rot after the jobs had gone and the money dried up. The notice in the newspaper promised opportunities for entrepreneurs, though in truth it was a last attempt by the city to offload its ghosts onto anyone desperate enough to claim them. Daniel walked into the courthouse with his life savings folded neatly into a battered envelope, $4,812, scraped together through 3 years of endless double shifts and the reluctant sale of his old pickup. That money was everything. It was rent, food, medicine, clothes for Lily, every hope condensed into a single fragile pile of paper. The auctioneer, a man with a voice that carried boredom more than authority, rattled off property after property. Small homes went quickly, snapped up by speculators with smooth suits and sharp watches. A handful of lots passed without a single bid. Then came the words that made Daniel straighten, his pulse quickening despite himself. Next item, Lot 23, the old Westbrook manufacturing plant on River Road. Minimum bid, $5,000. The room fell silent. A nervous laugh rippled through the sparse crowd. Everyone knew the factory 5 stories of steel and brick stretching over several acres, an eyesore of rusted beams and shattered windows. It had been called the Dead Giant since it shut down in the early 70s. For decades it had loomed on the edge of town, attracting only vandals, drifters, and the curious teenagers who dared each other to break in at night. The taxes on it were steep, the repairs unthinkable, the liability a nightmare. No one in their right mind wanted it. No one except Daniel. He gripped the envelope in his coat pocket until the paper softened under his sweat. He knew it was madness. He knew that every man and woman in that room would shake their heads if he opened his mouth. But he also knew that if he did nothing, he and Lily would spend another winter choking on mold in their rented coffin of a room, waiting for a future that never came. He cleared his throat, his voice coming out rough and too loud in the stillness. 4,800. The auctioneer blinked, his gavel pausing midair. Sir, the minimum is 5,000. Do you have 5? That's all I have. Daniel's voice steadied. 4,812. Every cent. A murmur spread through the room. Some scoffed. Others smirked, muttering words like fool and lunatic. The auctioneer glanced at the city clerk, who only shrugged. The truth was, the city would be glad to see the place gone for anything at all. No one had paid its taxes in decades. No one had maintained it since before Daniel was even born. Going once, the auctioneer said, his voice rising just enough to give the act a sense of theater. Going twice. Sold to the man in the back for $4,812. The gavel came down like a thunderclap, and in that instant Daniel's life lurched onto a path he had never imagined. His knees felt weak, his chest hollow, but beneath it all a current of something long dormant stirred hope. He signed the papers with trembling hands, ignoring the pitying looks from the other bidders. To them, he was a man who had just thrown away his last savings on a ruin. But Daniel was thinking only of Lily, of her small hands clutching her sketchbook at night, of the dreams she tried to hide from him. He would give her walls that were theirs, a roof that no one could take away, space where she could run and laugh without fear of drunks shouting in the hallway or plaster falling from the ceiling. 2 hours later, he stood at the gates of the factory with Lily's hand in his. The structure rose above them, immense and silent, its brickwork streaked black with rain and time. Weeds pushed through cracks in the pavement, and vines curled like ropes up the corroded fire escapes. Broken windows gaped like blind eyes across the facade. A rusted clock tower jutted against the gray sky, its hands frozen forever at 11:37. "It's scary, Papa," Lily whispered, her voice almost lost in the wind. Daniel tightened his grip on her small fingers. He stared up at the hulking mass, at the shadows pooled behind the shattered glass, at the faded lettering that once spelled out Westbrook Manufacturing in proud steel letters. To anyone else, it was a graveyard of industry. To him, it was possibility. "Only on the outside," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He pulled the heavy key from his pocket, the one the clerk had handed him with something like pity, and pushed it into the lock. The front door groaned as if resenting the intrusion, then swung open with a creak that echoed through the cavernous dark. They stepped inside together. The air was thick with the smell of rust and dust, but light slanted through broken panes above, catching motes that swirled like golden ash. The vast lobby stretched before them, its marble floor cracked and littered with debris, its iron pillars pitted and scarred, but still standing strong. High above, metal rafters arched like the ribs of some long-dead beast. In one corner, an ancient crane loomed, silent and skeletal, its hook swaying gently in the draft. Lily pressed close against his leg, her wide eyes scanning the shadows. Daniel's chest swelled with something fierce and protective. He saw more than ruin. He saw walls that had not fallen in 40 years, a roof that still held against storms, a foundation that would not crumble. He saw endless space that could be reborn into something new. "This is ours," he whispered to her, though his voice was steady only by force of will. "No one can take it now." Outside, the wind rattled against the broken windows, carrying with it the echoes of a town that had long abandoned this place. Inside, for the first time in years, Daniel felt the fragile ember of hope glow in his chest. He had nothing left but this building, a daughter, and a dream that refused to die. And in that moment, standing in the hollow belly of the dead giant, he promised himself he would make it live again. The echo of their footsteps lingered in the hollow belly of the factory long after the front doors had grown shut behind them. For a moment, Daniel felt as though he and Lily had stepped not into a building, but into another world, one defined by shadows, silence, and the ghosts of machines that had long since gone cold. That first night inside the factory, they did not dare venture far beyond the lobby. He chose a small room behind a set of iron doors that must once have been a storage office, its narrow windows boarded and its floor littered with broken glass and scraps of rusted metal. It was not much, but it could be sealed against the chill, and it gave them a pocket of safety in a structure so large it seemed alive with its own whispers. They set down the few belongings they had carried in a duffel bag and a milk crate: blankets, a second-hand camping stove, 2 plates, a battered flashlight, and Lily's sketchbook. Daniel had borrowed a pair of old army cots from a friend, and by the light of a lantern he set them up side by side, brushing aside the grime as best he could. Lily, with a bravery that always seemed older than her years, pulled her ragged stuffed bear from her backpack and placed it between the cots like a guardian. They ate canned soup warmed on the stove, the metallic taste mixing with the scent of dust and oil, and Daniel listened to the wind rattle the broken panes above. Each noise seemed amplified, the scurrying of rats in the walls, the groan of the steel beams as if the factory shifted in its sleep. When Lily lay down, she whispered that she was frightened, that the place felt too big, too empty. Daniel sat beside her until her eyes closed, his hand brushing the hair from her forehead. He whispered that she need not be afraid, though he felt the same chill running along his spine. But in the quiet moments after she drifted into sleep, he let his gaze wander across the cracked plaster and the skeletal beams above. This was what he had bought. Not just walls and rubble, but possibility. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of labor that tested every muscle and every ounce of patience he possessed. At dawn, he rose to walk Lily to school across town. She wore the same patch coat she had worn last winter, her small hand buried in his. When she disappeared inside the red brick building, with its peeling paint and tired teachers, he would turn back toward the factory with the knowledge that every hour he spent there was for her. He owed her not just food and shelter, but a chance at a different kind of life. Work began with clearing the debris that carpeted the lobby. He hauled broken chairs, shattered glass, and decades of trash into piles that he later dragged to a dumpster he rented with the last of his spare change. He attacked the rust with wire brushes until his arms trembled, and when he discovered a toolbox left to rot in a corner office, he treated it like treasure. He taught himself how to splice wires and replace pipes, hunched over his phone by the dim glow of a battery-powered lamp, watching shaky tutorial videos posted by strangers. Each small victory, the flicker of a bulb, the hiss of water sputtering from a faucet, filled him with a pride so fierce it startled him. At night, when exhaustion drove him to collapse on the cot, Lily would chatter softly about how she had decorated the walls of their makeshift room with her drawings. She taped scraps of paper side by side, sketches of castles, gardens, and smiling faces. She told him she wanted to make the factory beautiful again, so that other children might want to live there too. Her imagination painted light over rust, laughter over silence. She saw in the vast empty halls a place for children to run and play, not the haunted shell that adults whispered about. Yet even in his most hopeful moments, Daniel could not ignore the strangeness that clung to the building like a shadow. It was not just the size, though the sheer enormity of the place often left him dizzy. It was the locked doors he found at the ends of corridors, sealed with iron plates and bolts that looked far too deliberate. It was the narrow staircases that led upward only to dead ends, or downward into spaces choked with rubble where the air seemed unnaturally cold. Once, in the farthest corner of the basement, he found a metal cabinet stuffed with old ledgers and inventory sheets. Most of it was meaningless lists of gears, bearings, shipments of steel. But in one folder, stamped with a faded government seal, he found references to something called Storage Unit 7. The words were repeated in careful handwriting across several yellowed pages, always with notations that suggested secrecy rather than utility. He read the words aloud, tasting them in the hollow dark. Storage Unit 7. What was it? He flipped through the pages for answers but found none. There were no locations, no descriptions, only vague notes about access being restricted and clearance required. When he held the papers up to the light, he thought he could see where certain lines had been erased or redacted, as though someone had deliberately tried to obscure the truth. That night, lying awake while Lily slept beside him, he heard something that made his skin crawl. It was a low, steady hum, faint but distinct, vibrating through the floor beneath him. It was not the wind or the shuffle of animals. It sounded mechanical, like the slow breath of a machine that had no right still to be alive. The factory had been dead for 40 years, its power lines cut, its engines dismantled, and yet somewhere in the bowels of the structure, something still pulsed with life. He rose the next morning determined to find its source. Carrying a flashlight, he traced the sound through the maze of corridors until he came to a wall of welded steel plates. At first glance, it seemed like part of the structure, but closer inspection revealed the seams of a doorway long sealed shut. The plates had been welded thick, and heavy bolts protruded like scars. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep it closed. He ran his fingers along the cold metal, his breath fogging in the damp air. Beyond that door, he thought, lay the answer to the hum that throbbed through the walls at night. Beyond it lay the reason the city had been so quick to rid itself of the factory. For the first time since buying the place, Daniel felt a sliver of doubt creep into his mind. What had he brought his daughter into? But when Lily came skipping back from school that afternoon, her hands smudged with pencil from another day of drawing, she told him she had made a picture of the factory with flowers growing from every window. She told him she believed they could make it a place where people laughed again. Daniel smiled at her, though his thoughts were still trapped behind the steel plates. He tucked the worry away, convincing himself it was nothing more than curiosity. There was enough to do without chasing shadows. Yet as he lay awake again that night, listening to the hum beneath the floor and the whisper of wind in the rafters, he knew that curiosity would not rest. The factory was too large, too strange, and too deliberate in its secrets. And though he told himself he would leave it alone, a part of him already knew the truth. One day, he would have to open that door. The hum that had unsettled Daniel on those restless nights became a companion to his thoughts in the days that followed. He tried to push it aside, focusing on the work that demanded his body and his patience. But every swing of the hammer and every scrape of rust against his brush seemed to echo with that faint vibration in the walls. It was a reminder that the factory he had bought with the last of his savings was not as lifeless as it should have been. Something slumbered deep inside it, breathing in secret. He returned again and again to the wall of welded steel plates he had discovered in the basement. The light from his flashlight slid over the seams like water, catching on the heavy bolts and the uneven welds that sealed it tight. There was no doubt in his mind now that it had once been a doorway, and whoever had closed it had wanted it to stay closed for good. He pressed his ear against the metal one afternoon when Lily was at school, and though the steel was cold enough to numb his skin, he swore he could hear that strange hum more clearly, as though something beyond was alive and waiting. At night, as Lily drew new pictures of gardens and houses sprouting inside the empty halls, Daniel found his eyes drifting to the door of their little camp room, his mind wandering back to the sealed basement. He told himself there was no need to explore it. The factory was massive, and every day revealed new corners filled with dust and decay. But curiosity gnawed at him, quiet and persistent, until it felt less like a choice and more like inevitability. It was an old man in town who added weight to Daniel's unease. One morning after dropping Lily at school, Daniel stopped by the hardware store to buy a new blade for his saw. The clerk, a wiry man with a sharp nose, recognized him instantly. Word had spread quickly about the fool who had bought the Westbrook plant. The clerk chuckled, shaking his head. "You'll never finish cleaning that monster. My father worked there before it closed. Said it was cursed." The word made Daniel pause. Cursed was a term thrown around too easily by people who preferred rumors to truths. But there was something in the way the man said it that made him ask questions. Later that day, he found himself sitting across from one of the town's oldest residents, a retired mill worker named Conrad, who had agreed to talk after hearing about Daniel's purchase. Conrad's skin was leathery, his voice gravelly, and his eyes seemed to belong to someone who had seen more than he cared to remember. "Westbrook wasn't just a factory," Conrad said, stirring sugar into his coffee with a trembling hand. "Not after the war. They said it was all machine parts and steel beams, but we knew something else was going on. Whole sections of the plant were closed off. Guards on the doors, soldiers sometimes. People asked questions and got no answers. One of my friends disappeared after talking too much about it. His family packed up and left town a week later. We never saw them again." Daniel listened, the unease in his chest deepening with each word. Conrad leaned closer. "Whatever's still down there, boy, it's better left buried. You've got a daughter to raise. Don't go digging where you don't belong." That night, Daniel lay awake long after Lily's breathing had softened into sleep. He thought of Conrad's words, of the welded plates and the humming in the walls. He thought of the way the city clerk had seemed relieved when he signed the auction papers, as though a burden had been passed on. A rational man would have sealed the basement again and forgotten it. But Daniel was not rational anymore. He had too much to lose and too much to prove. If there was a secret hidden in this factory, it belonged to him now. The next morning he began to plan. He had neither the tools nor the strength to tear through solid steel quickly, but he had patience and desperation in equal measure. He scavenged scrap iron and fashioned crude wedges to test the seams. Sparks flew as he tried a borrowed grinder, the noise filling the cavernous basement like thunder. The smell of scorched metal clung to him long after he shut off the machine. For days he worked in secret, returning only when Lily was at school, his muscles aching from the double labor of renovation and excavation. Each night he returned to their makeshift room covered in soot, his hands blistered, his shoulders screaming. At first, progress was maddeningly slow. The welds held firm, stubborn against his efforts. But rust had eaten into them over decades, and with time the grinder began to bite deeper. He learned the rhythm of the steel, where it was weakest, where the bolts had corroded. Piece by piece, seam by seam, he peeled away the edges of a door that had not opened in half a century. Through it all, fear battled with determination. He imagined what might lie beyond. Barrels of toxic waste, crates of forgotten weapons, perhaps even nothing more than an empty room. But sometimes, in the moments when the grinder whined and the sparks danced, he caught himself imagining something far stranger, a treasure hoard, a vault filled with riches hidden away when the world was burning. He hated those thoughts, yet they returned, whispering promises of freedom from the endless grind of survival. Lily noticed the strain etched into his face, though she did not know the cause. One evening, as they ate beans from a dented tin, she looked at him with worried eyes and asked why he seemed so tired. Daniel smiled and said he was only working harder to make the factory safe. She nodded and told him she had drawn a new picture, a garden blooming on the roof with butterflies circling the smokestacks. Her innocence was both a balm and a blade, reminding him of why he could not afford mistakes. He would uncover the truth, but he would do it for her, not for greed. Finally, after weeks of effort, the day came when the last weld gave way, with a sharp metallic crack. Daniel stood before the door, his chest heaving, the air around him heavy with the smell of burnt steel. He braced himself, pressing his shoulder against the cold slab of metal. With a groan that reverberated through the basement, the door shifted, rust flaking away like dead skin. Slowly, agonizingly, it swung inward. Beyond lay a tunnel cloaked in darkness, the air colder than the rest of the factory, carrying with it a faint, sterile tang, like the inside of a sealed chamber. The hum he had chased for so long grew louder, a steady pulse that made the hairs on his arms rise. He lifted his flashlight, its beam slicing into the shadows, illuminating concrete walls lined with pipes that still glistened faintly with condensation. The passage stretched forward, deeper than he could see, leading him into the unknown. For a long moment Daniel stood frozen, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The factory had given him hope, a chance at life beyond poverty. But with the opening of this door, he sensed he had crossed a threshold that could never be undone. Secrets had been buried here, hidden from the world for reasons he could only guess at. By prying them open, he had invited them into his life and into Lily's. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, the beam trembling with his hand. The hum called to him, steady and insistent, like a heartbeat echoing through stone. He thought of Conrad's warning, of the clerk's relieved expression, of the silence in the auction hall when he had spoken his bid. They had all known something he did not. Now he was about to learn it for himself. He took a single step forward, the sound echoing down the tunnel. Then another. The door swung wider on its hinges, as if eager to swallow him whole. And with that, Daniel Harper descended into the forbidden level of the factory, carrying with him nothing but determination, fear, and the fragile hope that the truth he was about to uncover would not destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. The air inside the tunnel was colder than Daniel expected, a damp chill that clung to his skin and made his breath fog in the narrow beam of his flashlight. He paused at the threshold, listening to the groan of the steel door behind him as it settled into place. For a moment he thought of Lily, asleep in their makeshift camp several floors above, her small body curled under a heap of blankets, safe in the cocoon of her innocence. He almost turned back, telling himself this was madness, that he had no business wandering into passages sealed for half a century. But the hum pressed forward from the darkness like an insistent heartbeat, and Daniel knew he had already crossed the line of no return. He moved slowly, his boots crunching on the concrete floor, the flashlight beam trembling as it scanned the walls. The tunnel was not rough like the other basements he had explored. It was precise, engineered, lined with pipes that gleamed faintly as though condensation still formed on their surfaces. His hand brushed one of the pipes and recoiled instantly. It was warm, impossibly warm, as if something within it still pulsed after all these decades. His stomach tightened at the realization. The factory above was dead, but here something was alive. The tunnel sloped downward, the air growing heavier as he descended. Dust floated in the light, but not as much as there should have been, and that unsettled him more than cobwebs ever could. When he had first stepped inside, he had braced himself for rot, for mildew, for the choking scent of long-sealed decay. But instead, there was only that faint sterile tang, like filtered air inside a hospital. His mind struggled to make sense of it. How could this place remain untouched when the rest of the factory crumbled? After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a chamber that stole the air from his lungs. His flashlight swept across rows of metal racks, towering almost to the ceiling, each filled with wooden crates bound in straps. Beyond them, glass cases lined the walls, sealed and pristine, the contents inside glimmering faintly in the artificial light that seemed to hum from fixtures above. Daniel stopped dead in his tracks. The lamps on the ceiling were still glowing, not faintly, not in flickering fits, but steady and sure, as though someone had changed the bulbs only yesterday. The sound that had haunted him for weeks resolved itself in his ears. It was the low purr of climate control systems, the dehumidifiers and air filters whispering tirelessly, as they had for decades. The beam of his flashlight quivered as he raised it to one of the glass cases. His heart gave a violent lurch at the sight within. It was a painting, vivid and impossibly preserved, its colors so rich that they seemed almost to pulse with life. He recognized the style before he could believe the name forming in his mind. Monet. He took a step closer, pressing his palm against the cold glass, his breath fogging as he stared at brushstrokes that he had once seen only in textbooks and museum catalogs. Another case held a work he could not place at first, but the sharp lines and fractured light told him what his brain refused to accept. Picasso. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet, swinging the flashlight wildly to the next case and the next. Each one revealed another masterpiece, names he could not believe, canvases thought to belong only in the greatest galleries of the world. He turned toward the racks of crates and forced one open with shaking hands. Inside, carefully cushioned in straw and linen, lay sculptures of marble and bronze, some cracked with age but others intact, gleaming with the timelessness of art that had once been touched by genius. He found a bronze figure whose sinewed muscles seemed alive in the beam of his light. Rodin, perhaps, though he dared not trust his trembling memory. Another crate yielded a violin, its wood polished to a honeyed sheen, strings intact, a faint scent of resin clinging to it as though someone had played it yesterday. Daniel sank to his knees in the middle of the chamber, his body trembling, his mind refusing to keep pace with his eyes. This was no storage room, no forgotten warehouse. It was a vault, a sanctuary of beauty, hidden away from the world, preserved with a care that seemed almost reverent. And yet the reverence was wrong, twisted. These treasures had not been meant to rest in darkness, locked behind steel and silence. They belonged to families, to cultures, to histories ripped apart and left to bleed. He felt it in his bones as surely as he felt the cold air creeping through his coat. His flashlight beam caught a desk in the corner, mahogany polished to a dull gleam even after all these years. Upon it lay a stack of folders, each meticulously labeled, each bound with ribbons that had faded with time. His hand shook as he reached for the top one, unfolding yellowed pages covered in elegant script. Names leapt from the paper, names paired with photographs of paintings, sculptures, instruments. Beside each entry was another name, the name of a family. Many of them carried a mark that froze Daniel's breath in his chest. Deported, 1942. He sat heavily in the velvet chair beside the desk, the fabric coughing up a puff of dust that hung in the air between him and the words that seared his eyes. He read page after page, and the story revealed itself like a blade cutting into flesh. This was stolen art, plundered from Jewish families torn from their homes during the war. Treasures seized by men who saw beauty only in the weight of its price. The ledger did not lie. Each piece catalogued, each origin noted, each family marked by the shadow of loss. On the desk sat an envelope, brittle with age, addressed in ink that had not yet faded. To whoever opens this door. Daniel's throat tightened as he tore it open, pulling out a letter written in the same steady script. The words inside confirmed what his trembling heart already feared. A man named Arthur Klein confessed that he had once been a courier, tasked with transporting stolen works of art out of Europe after the war. But when he saw what he carried, when he understood what blood clung to the frames in marble, he could not bring himself to deliver them. Instead, he hid them here, telling his employers the truck had been hijacked and vanished into another life under another name. For decades, he lived with the guilt, too frightened to return what he had preserved, but too human to destroy it. He had created this vault, wired the climate systems, arranged a trust to keep them alive, waiting for someone braver than him to finish what he could not. Daniel let the letter fall onto the desk, his vision blurred with the enormity of what surrounded him. The weight of history pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He thought of Lily, of her drawings taped to the crumbling walls of their makeshift room above, of her faith in the future he had promised. He thought too of the families listed in the ledger, families who had been extinguished while their treasures were sealed away in darkness. His body ached with exhaustion, his mind screamed with possibilities, but beneath it all was the truth that cut deeper than any hunger or poverty had ever done. He could not pretend he had stumbled into mere fortune. He had stumbled into a graveyard of memory, and now he was the keeper of its ghosts. The flashlight trembled in his grip as he lifted it once more, casting its beam across the room filled with treasures more valuable than he could comprehend. The hum of the machines was steady, tireless, eternal. For 40 years they had protected these relics of beauty and of loss. Now they hummed for him, whispering a question he knew he would have to answer. What would he do with all of this? Daniel closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing against his ribs, and knew with certainty that his life had changed forever. He had come here seeking a roof, a home, a future for his daughter. Instead, he had unearthed the secrets of a century, a hidden vault where history itself had been locked away. And as he sat in that chair, surrounded by beauty and shadow, he understood that what lay before him was both a gift and a burden so immense it might crush him. Daniel remained in that velvet chair until the chill from the concrete floor had seeped into his bones, and the silence of the vault pressed down on him like a weight too great to carry. His flashlight, now dimming as the battery drained, cast a fragile cone of light across the desk, illuminating the ledger, the letter, and the corners of the room where the masterpieces kept their eternal vigil. He leaned forward, elbows braced against his knees, staring at the names inked so carefully in the records. Each one was a reminder that the art surrounding him was not merely beautiful, it was stolen, taken from homes where laughter once filled dining rooms and music drifted from pianos, only to be silenced by the brutality of history. He thought of Lily, sleeping just a few floors above, cocooned in her drawings and her dreams. She knew nothing of what he had uncovered, nothing of the secret he now carried in his chest like a live coal. He imagined telling her, watching her eyes widen in wonder as he described the paintings, the sculptures, the treasures so rare that they could change everything about their lives. One painting sold quietly, and she would never have to worry again. He could buy her a real home, a yard, books and clothes that didn't come secondhand from donation bins. He could ensure her future in ways he had never dared to hope. The temptation coiled around him like smoke, whispering promises of a life free from the constant grind of survival. But with every whisper came the echo of another thought. Those paintings, those sculptures, Those instruments, they did not belong to him. They belonged to families who had been stripped of everything, who had died without the chance to hold on to the things that carried their stories. He could not look at a Monet without seeing the small notation in the ledger beside it. Deported, 1942. He could not trace his hand over the smooth marble of a statue without imagining a mother or a child torn from their home, never to return. The vault was not a treasure chest, it was a tomb, and to profit from it would be nothing short of desecration. The conflict tore at him in waves over the days that followed. By morning he would convince himself to call someone, to report what he had found. By evening, after watching Lily's thin shoulders under her threadbare coat, he would imagine how easy it would be to take just one piece, sell it quietly, and keep the rest hidden. No one had to know. The systems that preserved the vault would continue to hum, keeping the collection intact while he plucked a single painting from the wall and turned it into the life he and his daughter deserved. He paced the factory's empty halls with these thoughts, his footsteps echoing back at him as though the building itself judged him for his hesitation. Sleep offered no escape. He dreamed of Lily playing in a wide green yard, her laughter bright, her arms outstretched toward a future without hunger or fear. But when he reached for her, the dream twisted, and the paintings loomed behind her, their canvases bleeding into shadow. The faces of families he had never met stared at him from within the brushstrokes, their eyes hollow, their voices silent, demanding what was rightfully theirs. He woke each time in a sweat, the sound of the climate systems in the vault humming through the floors like a relentless conscience. It was Lily herself who unwittingly delivered the sharpest blow to his indecision. One evening she returned from school with her usual energy, her small backpack bumping against her shoulders as she ran across the empty lobby to him. She pulled out a drawing she had made that day, proudly unfolding the paper. It showed the factory as she imagined it could be, walls repaired and painted, flowers growing along the windowsills, children playing in the wide halls while parents watched from benches. She had drawn herself and her father at the center, smiling, with the words written in a careful scrawl at the top. Our home. Daniel took the picture from her hands, his throat tight as he studied the lines. It was not the house she dreamed of, not a new place bought with wealth and security, but this factory itself, transformed into something alive again. She believed in him, without knowing the magnitude of the secret he carried below. He felt a swell of shame so sharp it stole his breath. If he took the treasures for himself, if he traded history for money, what lesson would that teach her? That integrity had a price? That the suffering of others could be a means to their happiness? He could not look into her trusting eyes and let that be the truth she learned. Still, the fear lingered. If he told the authorities, would they strip him of everything? Would they declare the factory government property, repossess the land, throw him and Lily back into the streets with nothing? He imagined cold offices, legal words he barely understood, men in suits telling him he had no claim, no right. His dream of giving Lily a home would vanish in an instant. For 2 days he carried that dread like a stone in his chest. He worked in silence, repairing broken stairs and patching roof leaks, his body moving through motions while his mind churned endlessly. He wanted to protect Lily, to protect the fragile new life they were building here. But every time he set down his tools and caught her smiling at him, every time she skipped down the hall humming to herself, he felt the decision sharpening like the edge of a blade. The turning point came on a night thick with rain. The storm rattled the broken windows of the factory, sending gusts of cold air whistling through the halls. Lily was asleep, curled under her blankets, her stuffed bear clutched tight in her arms. Daniel sat awake beside the small stove, the ledger spread open on his lap. He read the names again. Rosenberg, Bloom, Kaplan families marked by loss, their treasures preserved but hidden in silence. He thought of Lily's picture, of the words "our home" written in her careful hand. And he realized that a home was not built from stolen wealth. A home was built on truth, on the kind of integrity that would allow his daughter to grow up proud of her father rather than ashamed of the choices he had made. His hands trembled as he reached for the phone, the one he kept charged from the generator, the one he had never before used for more than calls about odd jobs. He stared at it for a long moment, rain hammering against the factory roof above. Then, with a deep breath that seemed to come from the bottom of his lungs, he dialed the number he had found in the letter, the Holocaust Museum in Washington. The voice on the other end answered softly, almost with surprise. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry, and said the words that would change everything. "I've found something you've been looking for." The silence that followed was heavy, and then the voice began asking questions, careful and deliberate. Daniel answered as best he could, describing the vault, the climate systems, the art, the ledgers. The more he spoke, the lighter his chest felt, as though a burden was lifting from him with each word. When the call ended, he sat in the dim glow of the lantern, staring at the phone, his heart pounding but steady. He had made his choice. Upstairs, Lily stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible before settling again. Daniel rose quietly and looked around the vast, ruined space of the lobby. The factory was still crumbling, still cold and broken, but for the first time since stepping inside, he felt as though it had truly become a home. Not because of the walls or the roof or the work he had done, but because he had chosen to make it a place of honesty, a place where his daughter could grow up knowing that doing what was right mattered more than doing what was easy. The storm outside raged on, but inside Daniel felt a stillness, a quiet certainty. He had chosen, and though the path ahead was uncertain, though it might bring hardship and risk, he knew with a clarity that settled deep in his bones that it was the only path he could walk. The morning after the storm, Daniel woke to the sound of silence that felt somehow different from every other morning he had spent in the cavernous factory. It was not that the place was quieter. Indeed, the ever-present hum from beneath the floors still vibrated faintly in the air, and the dripping of rainwater from the fractured roof continued its rhythmic patter. But the silence within himself had shifted. For weeks he had been carrying a weight so heavy that it bent his every thought. Now, having spoken the words into the phone the night before, that weight was gone, replaced by something that felt equally daunting, but far less suffocating: responsibility. He had done what he knew was right. There was no turning back. When Lily awoke, rubbing the sleep from her eyes and smiling at him as though nothing in the world could trouble them, Daniel realized she had no idea of the storm he had unleashed. He kissed her head, sent her off to school with her lunch in a paper bag, and then returned to the factory to wait. The call would not go unnoticed. The words he had spoken would travel swiftly through channels he could barely comprehend. And indeed, by the following evening, the world outside their small town had already begun to turn its gaze toward the ruins on River Road. The first sign came in the form of two black SUVs pulling up outside the factory gates just as the sun began to sink behind the horizon. Men and women stepped out dressed in dark suits, their expressions grave but not unkind. They introduced themselves as representatives from federal agencies, art recovery units, and the museum he had called. They spoke in calm, measured tones, asking to see what he had found. Daniel led them down into the basement, his heart hammering as the heavy door groaned open once more. He felt exposed, as though the act of showing these strangers what lay hidden made him vulnerable in ways he had not expected. Yet when they stepped inside the vault, their sharp professionalism melted into something closer to awe. Gloved hands reached carefully toward the glass cases, notebooks were opened, cameras clicked quietly, and murmurs filled the chamber as names were whispered: Monet, Picasso, Vermeer. The agents moved methodically, documenting each piece, checking the climate control systems, recording the catalogs Daniel had discovered. They asked questions he could not answer. How had it remained untouched? Who had funded the maintenance? What would be the legal ramifications? Daniel shrugged helplessly, feeling small among their authority. Yet one woman in a black suit placed a hand on his shoulder and told him with genuine warmth that what he had done was extraordinary. Word spread faster than he could have imagined. Within 48 hours, the quiet town that had for so long ignored the decaying bulk of the Westbrook factory became the center of an international storm. News vans lined the street, satellite dishes pointed skyward, reporters swarmed, their voices carrying questions and demands, their cameras flashing whenever Daniel so much as appeared at a window. Helicopters thumped overhead. Strangers stood at the gates, craning their necks for a glimpse of the building that had suddenly become more valuable than anyone had ever thought possible. Daniel shielded Lily from as much as he could. When she came home from school wide-eyed at the commotion, he held her close and told her that everything would be fine, that the noise and the crowds were here because of something good, something important. Still, he saw the questions in her gaze. She was too young to understand the weight of history, but not too young to sense that her father had stepped into something far larger than their small lives. Within days, the families began to arrive, descendants of those whose names were written in the ledger, many of them elderly, many carrying photographs yellowed with age. They walked through the factory doors not as tourists, but as mourners entering a place of reckoning. One woman, her frame bent with years, clutched a faded picture of her mother's music room, where a particular landscape painting had once hung. When the experts lifted that same painting from its case and showed it to her, she pressed her wrinkled hand to her lips and wept silently. Her grandson steadied her, tears running down his own face as he whispered words Daniel could not hear. Another man arrived carrying the diary of his grandfather, who had written with pride of a collection of sculptures that had vanished during the war. To see one of them again, perfectly preserved, was to feel a piece of his heritage returned. Daniel found himself at the center of these reunions, though he felt he had no right to stand among them. He listened to stories of lives destroyed, of families scattered, of traditions broken but never forgotten. Each painting returned, each artifact identified, was not simply a transaction but a restoration of memory. And as he watched these families clutch at fragments of their past, Daniel understood with even greater clarity that he had made the only choice he could. The town, too, began to change in the wake of the revelation. Where once his neighbors had dismissed him as a fool for wasting his savings on a ruin, they now approached with cautious respect. Old Margaret from the hardware store, who had scowled when he bought bolts on credit, arrived one afternoon with a box of tools, setting them on the counter of his makeshift office without a word. The Kowalski brothers, contractors who had once ignored him at the machine shop, knocked on the door to offer spare lumber and nails. Even his former boss, the one who had fired him for missing shifts when he first took on the factory, came by with an awkward apology and the offer of part-time work on his own schedule. Slowly, the walls that had separated him from the community began to crumble. It was not just local support that flowed in. Foundations, philanthropists, and cultural organizations began reaching out, offering grants and partnerships. Letters arrived from universities, from museums across the ocean, from families who had long since given up hope of ever reclaiming what had been stolen from them. Each envelope carried words of gratitude, of astonishment, of recognition. Daniel stacked them carefully in a drawer, though he could not bring himself to read more than a handful at a time. The enormity of it all was too much. Through it all, Lily remained his anchor. She did not fully grasp the magnitude of what was happening, but she saw the crowds, the flashing cameras, the strangers who treated her father as someone important. When she asked if they were rich now, Daniel knelt and told her the truth. No, they were not rich in money, but they had helped give back something priceless. She tilted her head thoughtfully and then drew another picture that night, a picture of the factory filled not with children playing this time, but with families holding hands around paintings, their faces alight with joy. She taped it to the wall of their little room, where the damp plaster curled at the edges, and smiled with pride. The officials who oversaw the recovery explained the legal protections. He had nothing to fear, they assured him. International laws safeguarded those who returned stolen art. There would be no punishment, no loss of his claim to the factory itself. In fact, they told him, there were provisions for rewards, for recognition, even for financial compensation. Daniel listened politely but shook his head. He had not done it for money. He had done it because he could not look at his daughter and teach her that greed outweighed decency. Yet the rewards came in other forms. The Rothschild Foundation, one of the largest philanthropic organizations tied to the very families whose treasures had been hidden in the vault, sent a representative named Michael Rothschild. He was not the kind of man Daniel expected. He arrived in jeans and a faded sweater, driving a rental car rather than a limousine. When he walked through the factory and listened to Daniel describe his hopes of turning it into something more than a ruin, he nodded thoughtfully. Later, standing in the very chamber where the paintings had been preserved, he asked Daniel a simple question. "What are your plans for this place?" Daniel laughed bitterly, admitting he could barely afford to patch the roof, that his only dream had been to keep a roof over his daughter's head. Michael was quiet for a long time, then told him he wanted to help. His family's foundation, he explained, had long invested in projects of community renewal, in places where history and healing could intertwine. The Westbrook factory was exactly the kind of project they sought, a site of tragedy and secrecy reborn into a place of community and memory. He offered to fund the renovation entirely, asking only that Daniel remain to oversee it, to shape it into what he envisioned. Daniel felt his knees weaken at the offer. He had expected perhaps gratitude, maybe a plaque with his name. Never this. The idea of transforming the broken halls into apartments, classrooms, community spaces, it seemed almost impossible. Yet as he looked at Lily's latest drawing on the wall, with its bright figure standing proudly within the factory's silhouette, he realized that perhaps the impossible was precisely what they had been waiting for. In the weeks that followed, change rolled through the town like a tide. Contractors arrived, workers filled the halls, scaffolding climbed the walls. Neighbors brought meals, donated materials, volunteered their time. What had once been a monument to decay became the center of hope. Lily skipped through the halls now filled with voices and hammers, her laughter echoing in the rafters. She told her father that she finally had her own room, one she could paint purple if she wished. Daniel smiled, tears stinging his eyes, knowing that for the first time in her life, she was right. The vault itself was emptied, each piece carefully removed under supervision, shipped to museums, to families, to places where they belonged. The humming machines fell silent at last, their decades of vigilance complete. Daniel stood in the empty chamber one evening, the dust settling in the absence of art, and felt both sadness and relief. The ghosts had been released. The factory no longer carried their burden alone. Now it was free to become something else, something alive. Outside, the town buzzed with energy. New businesses opened, drawn by the attention and the funding. Families who had left years ago returned to see what was happening. The air no longer carried the heavy resignation of decline, but the bright hum of possibility. And at the center of it all stood the factory, once called the Dead Giant, now stirring to life because one man had chosen to do what was right rather than what was easy. Daniel knew the work was only beginning, but he also knew he was no longer alone. The wave of change had begun, and it carried him and Lily forward on its crest, toward a future that felt brighter than anything he had ever dared to imagine. By the following autumn, the Westbrook factory bore little resemblance to the ruin Daniel had first walked into with his daughter. Where once there had been silence and the smell of rust, there was now the echo of laughter, the chatter of neighbors, and the steady hum of machines that no longer preserved secrets but powered classrooms, kitchens, and warm living spaces. Scaffolding had come down, fresh paint brightened the walls, and flowers Lily herself had planted peeked through the soil in boxes along the windowsills. What had been a husk of industry was reborn as a place of life, and though it stood with the same stone foundation and iron bones, its soul had changed entirely. Daniel had not expected the transformation to be so swift or so complete. In those early days after the discovery, he could scarcely imagine that such a broken place could be given a second life. Yet each week brought new miracles. Teams of workers funded by the Rothschild Foundation moved through the building, repairing structural damage, installing new plumbing, wiring, insulation. Volunteers from town appeared with meals, hammers, even furniture they had salvaged from barns and attics. Some came out of gratitude, others out of curiosity, but all stayed because they began to see what Daniel saw: possibility. The factory had been given back to the people, and the people in turn gave themselves back to it. Lily had her own room now, painted the soft purple she had chosen herself. Daniel remembered the day she had stood in the doorway, clutching a brush in her small hand, her face lit with an excitement he had never seen before. She painted wide strokes across the plaster, humming to herself, decorating the space with posters and drawings, until it was a child's kingdom rather than a corner of a ruin. For the first time in her life, she had a place that was hers alone, a place where she could close the door and feel safe. That single room, Daniel knew, was worth more than all the paintings hidden in the vault. The wider factory came alive with new purpose. The ground floor was transformed into community spaces, a daycare for working parents where children played under the watchful eyes of teachers, a commercial kitchen where neighbors gathered for classes and shared meals, a computer lab where teenagers learned skills for futures they could now imagine. Upstairs, the vast halls became apartments, each one modest but sturdy, offered first to families who had nowhere else to go, single mothers, elderly residents on fixed incomes, veterans who had been sleeping in shelters. Each key Daniel handed over felt like an unspoken promise kept, a testament that the sacrifices of the past could give rise to dignity in the present. But it was the uppermost level that carried the deepest meaning. The vault that had once hidden stolen art was now a museum of memory, built in partnership with the Holocaust Museum in Washington. The humming climate systems had been refitted to protect not masterpieces, but photographs, letters, and stories donated by the families who had reclaimed their heritage. Glass cases held mementos that spoke not of wealth, but of survival. A violin returned to its rightful heirs, now displayed beside the diary of the girl who had once played it. A painting that now hung in Israel, represented here by a photograph and the testimony of its descendants. The walls were lined with portraits of families who had been fractured by war, their stories preserved so that visitors could understand the true cost of forgetting. Daniel walked through that space often, his footsteps softened by the carpet, his heart heavy but proud. Where once he had felt only the burden of stolen beauty, now he felt the release of truth. The grand opening of the renovated factory was a day that no one in town would forget. The air was crisp, leaves painted gold and crimson scattered across the streets, and the entire community gathered in front of the building that had been reborn. Banners hung from the windows, children darted in and out of the crowd, their laughter rising into the cool air. On the stage erected in the lobby, Daniel stood beside Lily, who wore a new dress donated by one of the foundations, her hair tied back with a ribbon she had chosen herself. She beamed with pride, clutching his hand as he looked out at the sea of faces, neighbors, journalists, survivors, descendants, strangers who had traveled miles to witness the moment. He cleared his throat, words catching in his chest as he began to speak. He told them how he had walked into this building with nothing but a desperate hope to give his daughter a home, how he had seen only crumbling walls and shadows but had discovered instead stories that demanded to be heard. He spoke of the families whose treasures had been returned, of the volunteers who had lifted the factory from ruin, of the simple truth that buildings were not just stone and steel, but vessels of history. The crowd listened in silence, and when he finished, when he told them that this place belonged now to all of them, to every child who needed shelter, to every family who needed dignity, to every memory that deserved protection, the applause shook the rafters and sent tears streaming down his cheeks. In the weeks that followed, the factory became a heartbeat in the town. Old divisions softened as neighbors worked side by side. New businesses opened to support the influx of visitors drawn by the museum, and pride blossomed where resignation had once ruled. Daniel often watched from a distance as children tumbled across the community room floors, as families carried groceries into their new apartments, as elderly couples sat in the sunlight filtering through windows that had been broken for decades. Each scene stitched itself into the tapestry of a future that had once seemed impossible. For Daniel, the most profound reward came not from the recognition or the letters of gratitude, but from the quiet moments with Lily. One evening she tugged on his sleeve as they walked through the halls, now bright with fresh paint and warm light. "Papa," she said thoughtfully, "are you happy we didn't keep the paintings?" He looked down at her, at the trust in her eyes, and felt the question pierce him deeper than any doubt ever had. He knelt, his hand resting on her shoulder, and asked what she thought. She looked around at the bustling spaces, at the children laughing, at the families carrying furniture into their new homes. Then she said softly, "I think we got something better than money. We got a family, a really big one." Daniel pulled her into his arms, his throat tight with emotion. In that moment he understood that she was right. The wealth of canvases and marble had been staggering, but this living community, this renewal of dignity and memory, was worth infinitely more. As the sun set that night, painting the sky above the town in shades of rose and amber. Daniel stood outside the factory and watched the lights glowing warmly through its windows. Once it had been called the Dead Giant, a monument to decay and forgotten secrets. Now it stood as a beacon, alive with the hum of voices, footsteps, and laughter, a place where stories intersected and futures were built. It was not just a building anymore. It was a testament to the truth that integrity, once chosen, could ripple outward to heal wounds deeper than any one man's poverty. And when Daniel looked down at Lily, her small hand tucked safely into his, he knew that this was the legacy they would carry forward. Not wealth, not fame, but the knowledge that in the face of temptation and fear, they had chosen justice. The factory was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to the community, to the descendants who had regained their past, to every child who would grow within its walls. It belonged to history and to hope. Daniel smiled as the last light of the day bathed the building in gold. He had walked into the factory with nothing but desperation and $4,812. What he had found instead was priceless. The strength to do what was right, the rebirth of a town, and the certainty that his daughter would grow up knowing integrity was the truest form of wealth. And in the heart of that once ruined giant, now alive and radiant, the world seemed to whisper its agreement. Before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this. Up next, we've got more unbelievable true stories waiting for you. Click now to keep watching. And if this one moved you, share it with your friends and family, because some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.